Welcome to the Senior Rehab Podcast.
The podcast for rehab clinicians that want to better serve older adults.
And now, your host, Dustin Jones.
Hello, friends. Welcome to the Senior Rehab Podcast. Today, I'm excited to introduce to you Neil Maltby. If you've been listening to the show, you've heard him referenced several times, although I have called him Neil Maltby, which is just due to my ignorance. But his name is Neil Maltby, and he is an amazing physiotherapist over across the pond in the United Kingdom. He writes an amazing blog at becomingmorehumanblog.wordpress.com. You're very familiar with this blog if you listen to any of the podcasts, especially the Senior Rehab Shorts. I really appreciate his perspective, how he writes, how he thinks, and just his willingness to share his perspective on things. He's pretty active in the Senior Rehab Project Facebook group, which I'm very appreciative of, and yeah, he's just an awesome guy. So I'm excited for you to meet him, to hear his story, his career, and just his perspective on how we can be better physical therapists or physiotherapists, depending on who you talk to. So without further ado, Neil Maltby. Neil Maltby, welcome to the Senior Rehab Podcast. Thanks for your time.
No, that's not a problem at all. Thanks for having us.
I want to publicly apologize to you because regular listeners to the show have heard your name several times.
Yeah.
You read one of your blog posts at the end of one of Karen Litzy's episodes, and then I have read your articles on the Senior Rehab Shorts, and will continue to do so. And every time I've said Neil Maltby. Yeah. And you were just so kind to not come out and correct me in a very public manner, but you did so discreetly. And yeah, I just appreciate it and apologize for my ignorance.
It's no big issue.
That all kind of slips in there. So I'm excited to have you on. We've interacted a lot online on Twitter in the Facebook group as well, and just really appreciate your perspective, especially from your blog. But I would love to hear kind of the career path of the mysterious Neil Maltby.
Okay, so my career path. I started out at university, actually doing sports and exercise science at Loughborough University. Yeah. So definitely, probably similar to your story that I've heard, is that I'm very kind of sports background, and that was what I enjoy doing. That's a culture I like being in. I did and still play a lot of sports. Yeah. So the thinking was to go and do that, and then physiotherapy off the top of that.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt real quick. Yeah, so people like you, at that stage of the game in terms of at university, were you kind of the norm in terms of the typical person, the young adult that wants to go into physiotherapy?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a split in the UK. There's, certainly it's been a very traditionally kind of female-dominated profession. Yeah. Until recently, and then there's been a big increase, kind of in people, I guess, like myself. So there's quite a few people with a similar background to me who have done similar sorts of things or had similar interests. So I guess there was a little bit of a split from that point of view. Okay,
all right, keep going then.
Yeah, and then went to Sheffield to do physiotherapy. So I was there for 3 years, and still there now. I don't know how many years later. It's another kind of 9-10 years down the line. Worked in a few different places. So in England, we tend to go through rotations at a hospital. So we get assigned, or you get a job at a hospital, and then you work around every 3 months, and you do kind of core work. So I did work through some rotations, and then I moved kind of serendipitously into a kind of outpatient musculoskeletal post just in terms of career progression. And that's where I am now. So I've been in a couple of different jobs, but I've been in this role 6 years. I was in my first kind of 3.5 years, something like that.
Okay.
And that's where I am.
All right. So when you were going through physiotherapy school, I'm really going to say physiotherapy as much as I can during this podcast. What were you still kind of leaning towards the sports athletics realm?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I did my elective placement. So at the end of the course, you can set up your own placement. So I did a 2-week placement at Leeds United, which is a football club. And I spent 2 weeks doing there with kind of that in mind. Maybe it was those 2 weeks that kind of triggered. It wasn't really what I was expecting, and it started to make me just start to kind of question, or it planted a seed of maybe something else for me. Yeah.
And when I'm from West Virginia, when you say football club, you mean soccer?
Oh,
right?
yeah, no.
Okay.
I mean football, not American football.
The real football.
Yeah, that's right. The original.
Okay. So the transition, because, you've mentioned before that you have an interest in OA, low back pain, and medically unexplained symptoms. I mean, how has that developed? Because that's pretty interesting that someone's actually interested in those things.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess it's developed off the back of my current workload. So I'm based in GP surgeries. So I guess, do you have GPs in the US? How does it work?
Yes. We typically call them just like family practice physicians, but yeah, same thing.
So yeah, I work in there. So you see anything from kind of 8, 9, 10 years old through to kind of 90 odd years old. So it's a real varied workload and a lot of chronic conditions. So typically lots and lots of back pain, and typically lots and lots of arthritis. So I guess they've spawned an interest just because I see a lot of those different things. And medically unexplained symptoms is something that I've come across a little more recently. So they are basically things like back pain would be a medically unexplained symptom in terms of the non-specific. So we don't know what causes it. There's nothing that we can find on X-ray or MRI that would tell people apart. There's not a single cause to these type of things. So it's fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, those types of things which have lots and lots of background things going on, but not one thing in particular. And again, that's a lot of my client load. So I got interested in that and just started to do a lot more reading around that. So that's how I'm kind of how I got into those kind of spheres.
So if you let's compare, the Neil that started working in your current clinic and the Neil we have right now before us. What are some of the biggest differences in your clinical practice and how you handle some of these patients?
Good question. I think a heck of a lot has changed over that 6-year period. So I guess I came out probably relatively maybe manual therapy biased. Although because I've got the sports and exercise background from Loughborough, I was kind of heavily into the exercise, but I was very much about assessing and treating, and spent very probably little or minimal time looking at the patient's story. The subjective part was just kind of really, really basic to allow as much time for an evaluation and as much time for treatment as I possibly could.
Wow.
The thing that would have changed, now I spend quite easily the majority of my time doing a subjective assessment and really developing relationship and just getting into who the person is and what they are and why they're there, and spending a lot more time there, and then I let everything else kind of build from the back of that. So I would say probably that's the one main change.
Yeah, that's a big 180.
It's very different.
I'm curious in terms. I'm not familiar with your all's healthcare system at all. How are you all compensated in terms of? Do you all bill in terms of amount of time you spend with the patient, in terms of what you're actually doing, or how does reimbursement work?
It works in the NHS. It works through. It changes. It works through kind of funding groups. So basically, your GP or your family practitioner, they get budgets given to them by the government, because we are run in the UK, or certainly the public health services run from government-funded money. So they are given pots of money depending on their populations and whatever, and they hold all this money, and then they pay for the patient to have whatever it. So if they go to a physiotherapy, or if they go to have a surgery, or if they attend A&E, or whatever they have done, the GP pays that service the money.
Okay.
So yeah, we don't have to bill necessarily for anything. It's kind of, it just comes through the GP, and it's kind of worked through management.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. So, and I just say that because I've been in an outpatient ortho setting. This is my first job, and it was like a year and a half or a couple of years. I can't remember. I'm getting old, Neil. Getting old.
Got some time to go. Yeah.
We have this time-based system, where we say, what we're doing and how long we're doing it, and we'll get reimbursed on different rates. And the incentives are not to spend time with patients in terms of the subjective per se. There's definitely financial incentives to do an evaluation, and then maybe get in, a unit or two of treatment, initial evaluation. But regardless of that, if someone asked you, why do you spend so much time talking to your patients, how would you answer that?
Because it's going to tell me what I'm doing, essentially. So, I guess one of the things that maybe has changed kind of over the 6 years I've been in this post would have been I come from a very kind of protocol-based approach to conditions. So if somebody came with back pain, they would be getting the same as the next person with back pain, and someone came with knee pain, they'd get the same exercise as the next person with knee pain. And it was a very standardized, regimented plans that were given, and wasn't always, or sometimes it's effective, but it's not always massively effective for everybody. So one of the big things that I'm part of at the minute is a project called Cause Health, which is looking at kind of philosophy and kind of the underpinning of why we do what we do, and particularly some of these more tricky conditions where there's not an obvious cause, like back pain. And it's basically looking at what they call an N=1 approach, which is treating everyone as an individual. And I mean, it is kind of what it says it is. And I've heard lots of your other podcasts where I can see that definitely other people are doing things along sorts kind of side that those kind of lines. So yeah, the N=1 is you're looking at clinical reasoning rather than protocols. You're looking at, why am I actually doing this? What is it in their story that's telling me that I should kind of go down this line? What is it that they've said to me? Is it something about confidence? Is it something about balance? Is it something about social isolation? And so they're really going to inform what I'm doing, rather than, oh, you've come in with back pain, so I'm going to run through this because I've seen a study with good outcomes on this, or this is what's worked for my previous back pain patient, so I'm just going to duplicate that. That's that would be the big switch.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, what you just mentioned is definitely prevalent in a lot of what I've seen, and whether it's a nursing facility or home health, just kind of that protocol approach. And, it's worked on this other person, it'll work on this person. So, sometimes that works, but not all the time. But one word that comes out that I really appreciate that you talk about frequently is the patient's story. And, how, when that person is sitting in front of us, it's not just their symptom that they're there for. There's so much that can lead up to the situation that they're in now. And I appreciate you for, bringing that to light. And, you've definitely done that amazingly through your blog. Could you tell us a little bit about the blog that you started a while back?
Okay. So, I started a blog. I think it was October of last year. So I guess it's relatively recent.
Yeah.
In the scheme of things.
I'm going to interrupt you because I started the podcast and you started your blog right about the same time.
Oh, really?
So we're kind of brethren in that.
Yeah,
Okay?
Absolutely. Yeah. Put ourselves out there at the same time.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I guess from my blog had been, it had kind of been building for a while. So I'd had ideas and wasn't really sure whether I had the time or commitment or whether it was the right thing to do because I just didn't know whether it would be useful for people. So I just kind of sat on some ideas. So it sparked off with a conversation. There'd been kind of an underlying frustration within me and how I had been treating people, and kind of a dissatisfaction in who I'd become as a kind of this kind of input output. So the patient comes in with back pain and they go out with this because they've come in with back pain, and there was no clinical reasoning to what I was doing. I was literally just following a protocol, and I was kind of dissatisfied with that approach. So it had kind of come out of that frustration. There was a conversation I had on Twitter with Alan Taylor, who is another physiotherapist in the UK, and just how about we'd become quite robotic, or I felt like I'd become quite robotic in what I was doing, and that just kind of stuck with me, and that seed was kind of what was planted, and I sat on that for 6 months, and after 6 months it was kind of still there. So I thought, well, it's not just a flash in a pan, so I'll just stick something out there, and the rest is history. People have kindly read my rabbiting on.
What have you been surprised or
dead surprised? So when I read it, or when I wrote it, I was expecting I'd been on Twitter for a little bit, but hadn't got a massive profile on Twitter. So I was expecting kind of 30, 40, 50 readers. And that's kind of thought that would be reasonable, and I'd be happy with that. And it would be good just to kind of bounce ideas. So I'm really interested in getting people's feedback of what I've written. That's probably, again, one of the main reasons I'm writing. So I thought if I could get it out to 30, 40, 50 people and get some feedback, that would be great. But it's been kind of way over kind of my expectations in terms of what is achieved.
Yeah. So since October, how has that changed you as a clinician?
It just makes me think a lot more, which is great. This clinical reasoning is just basically thinking at the end of the day, and just getting into a pattern of thinking and not just assuming and not just taking things for granted, and just digging into stuff. And being a little bit more satisfied with what I'm producing for people and how I'm connecting with people in my clinic.
Yeah. What would you say to someone that has somewhat of an urge to write or to create? Because I know just from my experience, just the monotony of kind of checking in, checking out of our job, of like you said, kind of becoming robotic and just following protocols and not thinking. The ability to create something is amazing. But from your perspective, if you had someone that had that inkling, what would you say to them?
Probably the same as what you've just said. That's exactly it. something that will get your creative juices going. So it doesn't necessarily need to be writing. It could be podcasting like you're doing, or it can be just little projects. It can be getting into doing kind of experiments or into kind of systematic reviews, or just looking at the research, whatever kind of floats your boat and gets you thinking. So I don't think it matters really what it is. I think for writing, for me, is really important. It's something I've always enjoyed doing. But I would definitely encourage people to kind of maybe have, if you've got an idea, just sit on it for a while. If after 3 or 4 months it's still there bubbling under, then it's probably a good sign that it's something that's important to you, and it's not just a flash in the pan, and it's something that you want to invest into, and then just kind of go with it.
Yeah. And it seems like the creative juices are flowing in the family, because I've seen your wife's design and illustrations, and she's pretty amazing as well. You can tell her I said that. Okay.
I will do. I'm definitely the least creative in my family by a long shot. I'm very sports only. I'm good at sports, and that's about it. And I'm not even that good at sport. So from a creative point of view, I kind of tag onto my wife's coattails and hope some of it just rubs off.
You're doing a great job there. I've been wanting to ask you this because you've been pretty active in a lot of our conversations in terms of how we care for older adults, whether it's rehab or how we view them culturally, and in terms of the hot term ageism, which seems we're throwing that around a lot nowadays, which is not a bad thing. But
no,
how are things in the UK? You hear a lot of American therapists talk about some of these issues. Are you having the same issues there in England?
Massively. So there's been a couple of really big stories in the national press where carers have been jailed, and there's been kind of massive issues in care homes and things like that, where people have just been put through abuse, basically.
Wow.
So there is a real problem, I think, and a culture where kind of, I guess, as you get older, you can get more vulnerable, and that leads to kind of possible exploitation. Just not being thought of. I guess as you get older, you might not have the same voice. You're not got the same power, so you're probably not earning the same amount of money with the same amount of social kind of influence. So your voice can get lost a little bit. And it's really important, guys like you, and that last podcast was really, really great on ageism, that people are standing in their corner and really shouting out.
Yeah, Ashton Applewhite from This Chair Rocks.
That was great.
She's amazing. What about in the rehab setting and therapy? How do you see, or do you see ageism affecting rehab in the UK?
Yes. Again, probably kind of less obvious than kind of the really horrific stuff, but it's just kind of underlying, kind of institutionalized. You see, I mean, the typical thing for kind of geriatric care that I see in the UK is chair-based exercise regimes, which I guess for some people is great, but it's not massively progressive. So there's I think there's a lot more that we can do, and I think it's probably suiting some individuals okay, but I think there's a large group of people who maybe are not being suited well by how far they're kind of taken.
Okay. I would like to know, in your mind, in your perspective, and I know this depends tremendously, on each patient or person, human being, as you would say, that's in front of you.
That's right. Yeah.
What does progressive look like in your eyes? Let's say you have, I think of, someone I had today, 86-year-old woman, just kind of generally deconditioned, kind of weak, no major injuries or medical problems. They're just a little weak, and they're having a tough time getting around. What does progressive exercise look like in your eyes?
it's I guess it's challenging. It's being given a challenge and being pushed and engaged with, and not just being given a sheet of exercises and told to kind of just comply with what they've been given. You need to kind of engage with them about what's important for them, what they enjoy doing, what they like to do, what they might like to do. And just, being given challenges. I guess one of the big things that I see happen a lot. So again, in my role, so I'm not home health, but in the GP surgeries, we often see a lot of people who are 1, 2 years, 3 years, having retired from their job, and just a massive change in work levels, a massive change in activity levels, a massive change in challenge and kind of social standing as well. So where a lot of people come out and felt like the job that they had gave them kind of some kind of social input and importance, and then that's suddenly taken away, and all this challenge is kind of withdrawn. And I guess that's a very easy time for things to steadily decline. So I guess it's being aware of the patient, the person in front of you, and what their story is. And I guess I'm quite a big advocate in letting them guide where they're going and how far they're going. There's a lot of good research that says that people's self-perception of how much they're doing is a really good way of progressing. And so I tend to let them kind of guide and give them the incentive to work, and I'll give them occasional nudge along the way if I feel that's what they need. But I really try to get them engaged and less passive in the whole process.
Man, when I get old, will you be my therapist?
Absolutely.
Can we make that happen?
Yeah, you'll have to come over to the UK though.
Okay, all right. That's great, and that kind of ties into the next question I wanted to ask you, related to a conversation we had on the Senior Rehab Project Facebook group.
Oh yeah, I remember.
In terms of progression. The question stemmed from the episode with Margaret Martin from Melio Guide, and we were talking. I was talking with her about flexion-based exercises and deadlifting, and she's not a fan of deadlifting and said it was not a functional activity. And some people, a lot of people disagree with that statement. We talked about on the Facebook group, but we started talking about deadlifting and how we can do it safely. And a lot of us, me, mainly me, was just talking about, hip hinging with a neutral or stable spine.
Yeah.
And you played devil's advocate a little bit. Do you remember this conversation?
Yeah, I do remember.
All
yeah.
right, tell us what you said.
So, I guess the gist of what I was trying to say is, why are we being scared of loading up people who are older, essentially? And I guess the whole theory and philosophical kind of underpinning of the stable spine and keeping it neutral is that we don't want to load the spine because that would be a dangerous thing to do, which I guess has some merits to it in if it was a really unusual situation with very, very heavy weight, or it was way outside of what that person had ever done before or was capable of. But I guess I was just saying why are we scared of loading into a flex spine? I use loading into a flex spine with older patients all the time. Not with every single patient. So again, it's just having some clinical reasoning. So I think we get scared a little bit of going into a flex spine when actually what we are probably wanting to do is actually load the spine. That's a good way of loading the muscles and loading the musculoskeletal kind of elements of the back.
Yeah. I appreciate appreciate you bringing up that point, because for me, I was historically trained in kind of the McKinsey method, and you learn a lot about the disc and how bad flexion is.
That's right. Yeah.
And the majority of our time is spent in flexion, and then we can offset that with extension. And that really has penetrated my soul. And
absolutely. Yeah.
And you brought that point up, and you talked about loading a flex spine. And I started to look around on the interwebs, and then came across all these articles on just some of the old school kind of strongmen of how they would train doing a flex spine deadlift, and how they very methodically and progressively loaded their spine and lifting some crazy weight. And that just blew my world away, because everything that I had been taught and known was that flexion is to be avoided at all costs. And that those articles and you challenging me really kind of broke that down. But I would like to know, so say some of these older adults where you say, okay, I need to load, or I need to get them to flex their spine a little bit, and I may load it some. What are some of the indicators for that in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, it really does depend on, I guess, their physical state, the psychological state, and kind of their recovery strategies as well. So you've got to take into consideration kind of their dietary intake, their sleeping patterns, whether they smoke, all sorts of other bits and pieces, which will determine how quickly they respond or kind of load up. So yeah, it does really depend, and it also depends. So I'm a big advocate of clinical reasoning. It depends why you're doing it. So I will hip hinge with certain patients, but I will flex the spine of certain patients as well. So I guess with the hinge, you're looking to target the load goes somewhere. So do I want the load to go through the hips, or do I want it to go through the back, which is the area that I want to load up and strengthen, essentially. If I feel like, for whatever reason, I feel like the back is being overloaded, then I'll use a hip hinge, or I'll target the hips to try and offload that temporarily before I then look to build the flexion into the spine. But sometimes I'll just move into a flex spine. We get a case of loadophobia, which is just a real kind of, we're scared of kind of frailty in older people. And again, some people are going to be more prone to these things, but we just need to kind of clinically reason. And the other thing we've got to take into consideration as well, I mean, if you've got someone who's osteoporotic and you are loading them and you ask them to keep a stable spine, you are taking some of the load out of the spine, but you're putting all the load into the hip. So why are you not scared that the hip's going to fracture? Because you can get hip fractures. So the load's got to go somewhere, and it's and I think that's why it's important to get the patient on board as well, because they'll have a good idea of what they feel like they can do, and progression wise, then it's just a case of kind of a little bit of trial and error and doing nothing really ridiculous. But I tend to try and load people up as much as possible.
When we had this conversation, it made me think of a handful of patients that I've had that either had some kind of back injury before, where they didn't have any pain now, but I mean, the fear of God was instilled in them to flex their spine.
Absolutely.
And so to see them move they were so rigid, basically log rolling out of their bed, even if they did not have pain. And just to see, just so stiff. And I think of them, and it definitely made me wish I would have done a little more lumbar flexion.
That's a really good point. I guess the other thing that maybe I'd pick up on an evaluation is when you ask somebody to flex their lumbar spine, so reach down to their toes, do they do it without thinking, or do they kind of stand there and kind of look at you for a bit and be like, why do you want me to do this? Or they sometimes are a little bit apprehensive about bending forwards because, like you say, of a previous injury, and they've what they think protecting the back by not moving it, but actually that's not protecting it at all. That's making it weaker. So yeah, I guess there's things like that. Yeah, log rolling, lots and lots of bracing is another. Using way too much effort to do stuff that they wouldn't normally do. Sitting in very extended positions, not using backs of chairs, those types of bits and pieces. Flexion exercises and loading into flexion works really nicely, and it works really nicely on a strengthening level, but also on a graded exposure level. So you're building their confidence to do something that they thought they couldn't do, and then they realize they can do it.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely, and that is a double whammy. So I do use that exercise a lot. Like I say, I don't use it religiously with everybody. It depends what I want them to do. So you've got to clinically reason, why do I want to work the hips? Why do I want to work the back? What am I aiming to do here? And then you choose a strategy that's gonna be there for the n equals 1, not the n equals 500. We're just going to take the best of everybody and just hope that everybody gets better.
Right. And I just really appreciate that. I mean, there's several reasons why I like to podcast and interact online. And this is number one right here, is to have, smart people like you be able to give input and challenge, previously held thoughts. So thank you for doing that. So
That's all right.
I want to be respectful of your time and just ask some rapid fire questions. Your responses don't have to be quick by any means. And for listeners, just to give some context, Neil just got done playing soccer or football, as he would call it, and it's probably 11:38 p.m. right now, and he's up talking to me. Right? I mean, you're the man. You're the man. Yeah. So we'll wrap things up.
That's all right. Don't worry.
You got your 25-year-old self right in front of you. What would you tell him?
I guess one of the big phrases that's come along with my blogging is be more human. And I guess that would be something I would try to kind of instill into me as a younger person. So rather than just going through some motions or trying to copy other people or copy other plans, or like you say, copy a Mackenzie way or copy doing something a certain way, I would be saying kind of just be more human, try and get a better relationship with the people you're working with, understand them more, kind of use your human aspects rather than minimizing them, which sometimes it's a bit of a pet hate of mine when I see people kind of just kind of doing down on human traits when actually a lot of the time can be used really, really well. They can be used incorrectly too, but a lot of human traits are really, really useful as kind of clinical tools. So I guess it would be more human. Don't get sucked into what everybody else is doing or what the latest craze is.
Yes, that's nice. What's been some of your most helpful continuing education in your practice?
Probably writing my blog. Not from what I've written, just from it makes me go away and look at things and try and understand things. So it's anything that kind of triggers my interest. So I don't go on a lot of courses. A lot of it's through Twitter. Like you say, it's through interaction. So it's things like this or interaction on Twitter with other clinicians. And that would probably be my main form. And that kind of progressing.
I think that's a big lesson there, is how much you can learn just by doing. Just creating and not just sitting back and consuming and just slurping up all kinds of information.
Well, that's right.
Getting out there and doing it. So, all right, last one here. You have every geriatric rehab clinician in the room. You have 30 seconds to a minute to tell them something. What would you want them to know?
Again, probably just be more human. Develop a relationship, because if you can get a relationship with a client, with another person, then it opens so many doors to do things. You can encourage, but you can also challenge. So it's like with kind of any friends you've got or siblings or whatever. If you've got a relationship there, you can encourage, you can challenge, you can push people, you can be respectful, you can listen. There's leeway there to kind of really try things out, and you're not kind of having to be perfect, and you're not having to do things a certain way. You can try different things out, and you can challenge people without them kind of feeling upset, or they're more likely to respond in a kind of productive manner if the challenge is within a relationship than if you just come on the first day and just try and kind of kill them with kettlebells or whatever.
That's the truth, man. My gosh.
Yeah.
That's the truth. Be more human, be less robot.
Yeah, that's right. That's
thank you,
phrase.
Sir, for your time and just sharing, your perspective and how you think, and just some of, your stories on your blog. I mean, everyone listening to the show has heard, probably, half of your articles by now. And we'll continue to hear more, cause I love sharing your stuff. But if anyone has not come across becomingmorehumanblog.wordpress.com, get on it. It's amazing stuff. Very easy to read, very entertaining, and just very thoughtful. So, Neil, so we mentioned the blog URL. Where else can people find you online? What's your Twitter handle in specific?
It is Neil_Maltby, MALTBY, at Twitter, and that's probably the best place. I am on Facebook as well, but Twitter is probably where I'm the most active, and that's where my blog goes through. So I'm on there most days.
All right.
So I'm happy to collaborate or grab ideas or whatever through Twitter is great.
Okay, Neil Maltby, not Neil Matby. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you.
Hit me. Thank you for listening to the Senior Rehab Podcast. The show notes for this episode and much, much more can be found at seniorrehabproject.com. If you found value in this conversation, please share this with one other person that could benefit. And until next time, do not forget to stay funky.